Okay, so let's start with sine. So the rest of this chapter will be dealing with sine, and then the other question will have cosine and tangent as well. And what it wants us to do is find the unknown side. In this case, it's labeled here as a c, which makes sense because there's a capital C and a lowercase c, so the c does make sense. And it's not, there's no label here. So when you do this, you're trying to find yourself a perspective. Where are you going to look? Now, I'm not going to choose, well, first of all, I'll zoom in here. I'm not going to choose a 90-degree angle because you can't choose that. You're never allowed. That only leaves A and B. So you're going to want to choose the one that has some sort of information there. So clearly, there's no information with A. There's no numbers there. So B is going to be your perspective. So we'll start there by labeling that's our perspective. And because of that, I'll go across here. That is my opposite. So I'm just going to label that opposite immediately. And of course, the hypotenuse is always opposite of 90 degrees. So this will be the hypotenuse. It's always the bigger side. And clearly, that side does look bigger. And that leaves the last side to be adjacent. So it's always good for step number 1 is to always label. So always label. But you're going to need your perspective first. So find your perspective / your reference. Some people call it reference. Which angle are you referring to first? So you got to find your perspective or your reference first, and then you can go and actually do this labeling. Once you found that, you want to choose things that you have or that you need. Well, so I have 50. That's my opposite, and I need my hypotenuse, O and H. So when you do these questions, it's always good. The very top. So ka toa. And so then you're looking. You're like. You look at this question, and you've circled O and H. O and H. Which one is O and H? Oh, this one is. And so you immediately say, okay, I'm going to choose. So I choose sine. That's what you're choosing to do. Why are you choosing sine? Because you have the information for opposite, and you actually need the information for hypotenuse. You don't need this side, you don't need the adjacent side, and you don't know anything about it. So you're going to have choose sine. Why? Because O and H. That's why, which is SOA. So, okay. So now let's actually do this, doing a question. Now that you know so, you can write sine of some angle, which we put as theta, that's what that symbol means, it means theta, equals the O over hypotenuse. That's your formula. How do we know the formula? Well, you saw O and H, so I did O divided by H, I just wrote the letters, opposite over hypotenuse, and I knew sine from the S. Okay, so this is all the information, this is our formula here. So we can fill it in with sine theta. So maybe we can put a little note here. That little symbol, it's like a 0 with a line through it. That means your angle. So in this case, my angle is 30 degrees. And then we have opposite. Now what's our opposite? Our opposite is 50. And our hypotenuse, what's our hypotenuse? We don't know. So we leave that as whatever letter it is. In this case, it's C. Now you're going to need your calculator, and you're going to need sine of 30. You're going to put, sorry, this just kind of cut out here. But I'm going to try this calculator just to show you a different one. This calculator, I don't hit the sine button first. So I'm doing sine of 30, so I have to do 30, and then I can see the sine. There's sine, cosine, and tangent, so I'm going to choose the sine. 0.5. Okay. So 0.5, that's what this equals. 0.5 equals 50 over c. Now you need to find the unknown. We're doing some algebra here. I can't have c on the denominator, so I'm going to multiply by c on the numerator, and those will cancel. And unfortunately, I don't have very much room, so I'm going to bring this up here. So now I have 0.5 times c, so 0.5 c equals 50. And then I can divide by 0.5 and divide by 0.5. Those can cancel out, and c equals 50 divided by 0.5, and I know that to be 100. 50 divided by half is 100. So this side, I have found this hypotenuse here. I have found that it is 100. And so how did I do that? And you're going to find a rhythm for all of these. Step number 1, like I wrote up here, step number 1 is always to label. Now that you've done that, you can choose your equation based on what you labeled. And so in this case, we chose sine. So I had to make up a formula, and you're going to have to memorize it. Sine of some angle, sine of theta, equals opposite over hypotenuse. Once you have that, you can plug in the information. There's 3 things that are always going to be missing. There's an opposite, there's some sort of side, there's another side down here, and there's an angle. And I'm always going to give you 2 pieces of information. Sure enough, here I gave you the opposite and I gave you the angle, and you had to find the hypotenuse. Let's see here. The first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to label. So we've got to find our perspective. Now you can't have your perspective be 90 degrees, and having the perspective be absolutely nothing is also a terrible idea. So we're going to choose our perspective to be here because there's some information already there. Now that we have that, I can take a look. Now this is the hypotenuse. It's really obvious because it's the longest side, but also because it's opposite of the 90 degree. So that's the hypotenuse. Now take your perspective, go to the opposite side. That will be labeled as opposite. And then, of course, this is adjacent. That's the leftover one. Now adjacent just means beside. So from our perspective, we are beside here. Turns out we're also beside here. It's just that that already has a special name. That we don't just label them adjacent 1 and adjacent 2. We label this one as hypotenuse, and therefore the other one will just be labeled as the other adjacent. So we label it as adjacent, opposite, and hypotenuse. Now we need to choose a formula. So I need to find D. So that's an immediate thing that I have to circle. And I'm given some information here. So that's O and H. O and H, that is so. So our formula is going to be based off of that. So the formula you have to remember, you have to memorize, is sine of some angle equals opposite over hypotenuse. Now the angle that's given to us, our perspective, is 18 degrees. The opposite is labeled as D, and the hypotenuse is labeled as 10. Now sine of 18, we can take a look at our trig table and see what that is, or we can use a calculator depending on what's given. Just because it's easier here for me to constantly bring up a calculator, I'm going to use that, but in class it might be a table. So sine of 18 degrees is 0.309. 0.309. Sine of 18 is 0.309 is equal to D over 10. Now I need to get D alone, so I'm going to multiply the numerator by 10 and multiply the numerator by 10. And D equals, well, whenever you multiply by 10, you can move the decimal place over. So this is 3.09. That is the length of D. Okay, so I would say that this letter here, this letter B that we did, this question is a lot easier. And one of the reasons I think it's easier is because the unknown D was on the numerator. in the previous question, it would have been 0.309 equals 10 over d. And then we would have had to multiply both sides by d to get rid of it on the denominator. And then we would have 0.309 d equals 10. And then we would have to divide by 0.309 on both sides. And it's just a little bit more work. And that's all because d was on the denominator. Now, for us, thankfully, this question, d was on the numerator, and so we could just move over the 10. Okay, so in the next two examples, we will go over angles, how to find the angles. But let me just zoom out here in case you need to take a look at anything.